The Life of St. Jerome by Father Largent. Chapter 1. The Works of St. Jerome. Our readers are by this time familiar with the works and the teachings of St. Jerome, for it would be well nigh impossible to write the life of this great man without making frequent quotations from the pages in which he has given us a most lifelike and sincere portrait of himself. And the narrative of his life would indeed be incomplete were the doctrines and doctrinal controversies which so largely filled it passed over in silence. Jerome was before all, and therein lies his principal claim to fame, the commentator and translator of religious literature. It has already been mentioned, and it will be sufficient to recall the fact that the whole of the New Testament and all the proto-canonical books of the Old Testament, that is to say, those which belong to the Jewish canon, and of which the sacred character had never been questioned, underwent revision or translation at his learned hands. Of the deuterocanonical portions of the Old Testament, the portions which were the object of suspicion shared by Jerome, but definitely removed at the Council of Trent, he only translated the books of Tobias and Judith, and the disputed passages of Daniel and Esther. Jerome's revered love for the Holy Writ did not recognize individual fancy or private judgment as having any right to interpret it. He considered that the authority which guarded it should also expound it. When Philip asked the man of Ethiopia, the eunuch of great authority under Queen Cadence, who was reading the works of the prophet Isaiah, "Understandest thou who thou readst?" He answered, "How can I expect some man should guide me? As for me, if I may be allowed to speak of myself, I say that I am no more of a saint or no more zealous than this stranger who, leaving this sovereign's court, had journeyed to the temple from the remotest part of Ethiopia, who loved the divine laws and teachings to the point of reading the scriptures in his chariot, but who, although absorbed in meditating and repeating the oracles of the Lord, still ignored him, whom without recognizing he worshipped, in the Holy Bible. Philip came and revealed to him Jesus concealed in the scriptures, as if under the rind of a tree. The Ethiopian was instantly convinced, as he was baptized, became a believer and a saint, and from having a disciple became a doctor. He learned more from the solitary spring into which the church immersed him, that he had learned under the gilded canopies of the synagogue. In a letter to Pamanakius, Jerome, the translator of the Holy Scriptures, expressed his ideas upon the proper manner of translating. He frankly confessed, justifying himself by the example of Cicero and Terence, and by Horace's precepts, that when translating Greek works in Latin, he did not bind himself to be scripturously literal. His desire was faithfully to render the author's thoughts, and when he considered it necessary, adapt the forms and figures of speech which they employed to the character of his own language. From this rule, however, which Jerome had established for his own use, he accepted the translation of the scriptures, in which he said, "There is some mystery, even in the very order of the words, of the language and the style employed in the Hieronymian version of the Bible." Volanium said, and we cannot do better than to repeat his able and just words upon the subject, that human language has never received a more violent shock than in this sudden outbreak of the thoughts of the prophets and the biblical hyperbole into the idiom of Cicero. The result is indeed unique, partly owing to the literal translation which introduces such strange forms into the Roman tongue, and partly because of the coined words with which the learned hermit of Bethlehem was inspired by his zeal and by his efforts to emulate the text. In the course of this biographical sketch, mention has been made of Jerome's biblical commentaries, which, with the exception of the later ones, he has himself enumerated in the last chapter of his De Viris Illustribus. It may truly be said, wrote Richard Simon, a critic against whose true worth we must not allow ourselves to be prejudiced but by his irreverence and his, at times, excessive audacity, that in his knowledge of Hebrew, Chaldean, Greek, and Latin, Jerome possessed the necessary qualities for properly interpreting the scriptures in a greater degree than all the other fathers. Not only had he read and examined the Greek versions in orations, Hexlia, but he had also frequently conferred with the most erudite Jews of his day, and he rarely took any steps in his scriptural work without first consulting them. In addition to this, he had read every author, both Greek and Latin, who had written upon the Bible before him. And finally, he was well versed in profane literature. Jerome's best method was the one which he employed in compiling his commentaries upon the books of the prophets, in which he first gave the ancient Latin version, then in usage adding to it a new one which he had made from the Hebrew's text. He then compared the ancient Greek versions in his commentaries so as to better understand the value of the Hebrew words. Indeed, we have no author from whom we may better gather the literal meaning than from Jerome. No author who can instruct us more thoroughly in the criticism of the holy books than do the works of this father. Jerome did not only expound the Bible in the biblical commentaries, which he had left us, but many of his letters are of an exegetical character. In letters written to the Pope Damasus, to evangelists and Dardanus, and to many monks and women who, without personally knowing him, turned towards him from the different standpoints of Christianity, craving his instructions, Jerome strove to solve the difficulties submitted to him, and to conciliate the diversities and the apparent contradictions in the sacred story. Jerome was skilled in polemic, as well as in exegesis and criticism. His treatises against Herodotus, Jovinius, and Vigilanius, and his dialogue against the disciples of Lucifer of Caligari, his answers to John of Jerusalem, and his dialogue against the Pelagians are all examples of his polemical writings. In these hostile works, which contain passages of great eloquence, but which are by no means free from faults, Jerome's fiery spirit had full play. Jerome's great strength lay in the fact that he maintained against his adversaries the position of a steadfast champion of a tradition, a field which he knew well, and upon which, like Bossuet in later years, he was thoroughly in his element. With what precision and with what a masterly touch did the Bishop of Meaux quote, summarize, and judge his illustrious predecessors, the fathers whose imposing tradition he has continued. Jerome also had studied his predecessors and knew how to characterize them. He enumerated them in a letter to Magnus, the orator, beginning with the Greeks. Quadratus, a disciple of the apostles and bishop of Athens, who had offered an apology of the Christian religion to the emperor Herod, and his alert and inquisitive mind had led him to Elichius, the eloquent Astrides, another who had defended Christianity before the same Prince of Justice, Melitene of Sardis, Apollinarius of Hierapolis, Denis of Corinth, and Irenaeus of Lyons, the historian of the early heresies. Jerome also mentioned Origen, the Roman senator Apollinaris, whose eloquent apology has been found in the present century, Julius Africanus, Gregory Thesmachorus, Denis of Alexandria, and Anatole of Laodicea, and the priest Pamphilius, Pyrrhus, Lucian, Melaconian, Eusebius of Emesa, Tertullius of Cyprus, Asterius of Scythopolis, the venerable confessor Serapion, and the illustrious Cappadonians Gregory, Basil, and Amphiliochus. Then followed the Latins, Tertullian, whose Apologetica and whose works against the nations are a reservoir of secular knowledge, Menicius Felix, a Roman lawyer, who in his Ovicterius and in his book against the astrologers, providing the title of this last work is correct, has touched upon all the works of pagan literature, either to make use or to refute. The blessed Serapion resembles the pure spring from which wells sweet and tranquil waters. The language of Victorinius, who received the martyr's crown, did not do justice to his thoughts. Lactantius recalls to me the flood of Ciceronian eloquence. Would to God he had established our beliefs as effectually as he destroyed the adverse heresies. Arnobus is unequal and exaggerated. A faulty arrangement renders his work confused. St. Hilarion speaks in obsolete heroics. The flowers of Greek rhetoric with which he adorns his style, the long periods in which he envelopes it, renders it almost unintelligible to the unlearned reader. In the reign of the Emperor Constans, the priest Juvecanus wrote the history of our Lord in verse, and did not shrink from subjecting the majesty of the gospel to the laws of meter. Jerome waged his war against the innovators, attended by all these witnesses, and armed with the resources they afforded him. He confronted their audacious denials, not only with a positive text, but with the constant usage of the church. Thus to Vigilanus, a scoffer at the cult of relics, he showed the Roman pontiff and all the bishops of the world offering the Eucharistic sacrament upon the tomb of the martyrs. He had, ere this, pleaded the teachings and the traditional uses of the Catholic to the partisans of Lucifer of Caligari, who, in their fierce zeal, declared the bishops who had signed the inadequate formula of Rimini to have irrevocably forfeited the right to discharge their duties, and reiterated to the baptism conferred by the heretics. Wiser and more merciful than the sectarians, who under various titles, Novatians, Monotanists, Donatists, Luciferians, strove to enclose within narrow limits a society intended to embrace the whole of humanity and the entire world. The Church, by her councils and her numerous acts, has constantly offered pardon to repentant heretics, and has frequently restored their hierarchical rank. Bishops who had been momentarily led into heresy or constrained by violence. To the sophism of the deacon Hilarion, who had pretenitiously defended rebaptism, Jerome opposed from preference the custom of the Roman Church as being more decisive than the contrary attempts of distinguished and saintly adversaries. Serapion sought to avoid polluted springs and untried waters. So as further to separate himself from them, he condemned the baptism of heretics, and sent to Stephen the Pope, and the 22nd successor of St. Peter, the decree passed upon this subject by the Council of Africa. Serapion's effort was fruitless. Later, the same bishops, who, with the bishops of Carthage, unanimously had decreed the rebaptism of heretics, having reverted to the ancient custom, passed a fresh decree. Other popes, Julius, Mark, and Silasar, upheld in their turn their baptismal discipline, and the Council of Nicaea solemnly proclaimed it. Does not Jerome at times exceed in his polemical writings? Does one not find in them cutting personalities, cunning arguments, and pleasantries, which the austere good taste of a Bossuet or a Fenelon would have shrunk from? Did he not wish sometimes to prove too much, and for this very reason did he not succeed in provoking doubt and opposition? The treatise written against Jovanius, a traducer of Christian virginity, aroused much criticism, even during the lifetime of its author. Jerome was accused of having been too vehement in his depreciation of matrimony. Perhaps the picture which he drew of woman towards the end of the first book may remind the pernicious student of the 17th century too much of Boileau's famous satire, in which are mingled both the enfeebled inspiration of Juvenal and the accents of a sorrowful old age, and which Bossuet, although a friend of the poets, censured so severely. This man has taken upon himself to blame women. He seems regardless as to whether he condemn marriage and estrange from it those to whom it was given as a remedy. But there certainly is a wide gulf between the selfish and, after all, fallacious and more celibacy, which the satiric poets lauded, and the devoted celibacy extolled by Jerome. If Jerome, however, was at times unduly influenced by his humor or disposition, if he painted his picture of feminine faults and vices in too somber colors, the friend of Paula, Eustochia, Marcella, and many other noble virgins and martyrs personally corrected the exaggerated character of his description in the enthusiastic eulogies he had shortly before bestowed upon various historic or fabulous heroines. As to the contempt for the marriage tie with which Jerome was accredited, He exterminated himself upon this point in an apologetic letter to Epimeneus, in which he recalled that in the incriminated treatise he had proclaimed the legitimacy of marriage, and that he had steered an even course between the Jews and the Gentiles, who did not understand the virtue of perfect continence and the original sex, whose false spiritualism condemned all union between the sexes. As cautious traveler, I warned my reader that almost every step that I regarded matrimony as lawful, although preferring the continence of widows and virgins to the married state. A wise and kindly reader would have interpreted those of my assertions which seemed to him unduly severe by the context, and would not have accused me of having advanced contrary opinions in the same work. Does any writer exist so stupid or so ignorant of his art as to praise and censure the same thing, as to destroy that which he had built so as to rebuild that which he had destroyed, and after having triumphed over his enemy, to pierce himself with his own sword? Jerome, moreover, as he frequently asserted, merely repeated the teachings of his predecessors, and the polemical writer, confident in the doctrine which he had not originated, but which he had received, turned upon his adversaries in tones of vengeful irony. "Execrable crime," he cried. "The churches are ruined. The entire world has stopped its ears so as not to hear me, because I have declared virginity to be more holy than matrimony." Jerome terminated his defense with an humble allusion to his past. Finally, "I protest that I have never condemned marriage, that I do not condemn it," I answered my adversary, Jovanius. "I have not feared the pitfalls which my own people might lay for me. I extol virginity to the skies, not that I possess it, but because I admire above all a blessing that is no longer mine. To praise another that wherein one is oneself deficient is a sincere and discreet avowal. The weight of my body holds me down upon the earth. Is that a reason to admire the flight of the birds any the less? Should I not praise a dove which swiftly traverses space without even stirring its wings?" The controversialist, whom we have been studying frequently, executed the work of an historian, for which he was fitted, to a certain extent at least, by his vast and accurate memory, and by his taste for erudite researches, and for which the eloquence with which he was naturally gifted did not disqualify him. Who could not complain of Sallust and Tatius's having been eloquent? Many pages from history are to be found in Jerome's polemical treatises. Take, for instance, the description of the Council of Rimini, and a narrative of the events which followed. The ship of the apostles was in jeopardy. The tempest raged, the waves beat incessantly upon the sides of the boat. Thank you for joining me on this 6th chapter of the life of St. Jerome. I hope all of you have a great day, and may God bless you all. Until next time.